want to talk now about the general nature of the Spanish, of the War of the Spanish Succession, and then proceed into a discussion of one of the representative sieges of that conflict, the siege of Lille in 1708. So, let me share the screen with you. Never, never anything else but an awkward process. Okay, here is a map of Europe as it existed at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War of the Spanish Succession. Sorry. Okay. Spain and France are allied. What I'm doing is I'm going to proceed in a clockwise direction from the left part of the map and then proceeding on, obviously clockwise till I get done. Initially, Portugal kind of sided with Spain, but once warfare began, they sided with Portugal. Or sorry, they sided with the Allies, and I'm about to describe, and remained with them for the balance of the war. So if France and France and Spain are allied. Okay, then you see England. And then as you proceed, and then as you look next to England, you see the Dutch Republic. That's in yellow. And then just below the Dutch Republic, you see something you may not really expect to see, and it's called the Spanish Netherlands. And it is a Spanish possession, as are several territories in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so it's really worth noting that although it's a small region where, the Spanish Netherlands is actually an important element in this conflict. Okay, proceeding again clockwise, what you next encounter, this white area, that is part of the Holy Roman Empire. And it's the part that includes basically a lot of really little, German-speaking principalities that are really no big deal in themselves and are in any event dominated by the Habsburg monarchy, which is the yellowish thing, off to the east, right in the center of the map. And to make things even more complicated, part of the Habsburg monarchy is within the Holy Roman Empire, and part of it lies outside of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Finally, east of the white part of the Holy Roman Empire and north of Habsburg monarchy, you're going to see Prussia, a rising European power, then strictly called Brandenburg Prussia, but well on its way toward great power status. Now, I know all of this sounds pretty complicated, but that's kind of the point, because in the 18th century, Europe still had a kind of a loose jointed feel to it. But new factors, particularly an ideology called nationalism, which we'll begin to discuss when we get to the French Revolution, generated forces that during the 19th century went a long way toward creating Europe as we know it today. In essence, a much simplified Europe than the one that we're looking at now. And this process of simplification by way of this ideology of nationalism would really be completed in the 20th century. So, but in the meantime, let's make it easy. You have France and Spain fighting together. Spain is the lesser partner. Doesn't have as much an army or a navy, doesn't have as much in the way of wealth. The real brunt of the conflict is France. And so it wouldn't quite be correct to say that France is fighting alone in this conflict, but it wouldn't be that far from the truth either. Now, in terms of the Allies, just the easiest way to look at it is just Portugal, England, the Dutch Republic, the Habsburg monarchy, and Prussia. And together they comprised a force that we're just going to call the Allies, okay? Making it as simple as it can. Now, what are the characteristics of the War of the Spanish Succession? Well, they're basically the same characteristics that you're going to see throughout the age of limited warfare. And what you have is what historian John Lynn has called war as process. And because we think of war as being decided by great battles, which John calls war as event. This was not the case in the War of the Spanish Succession, nor the age of limited war in general. Well, what characterized the war as process model? Well, the first one is the indecisive character of military operations. Battles and sieges did not significantly move the conflict in the direction of victory or defeat for either side. Secondly, is just the slow tempo of operations. They just didn't move very fast during the during the War of the Spanish Succession. I'm chiefly an American historian, and so I default to Spanish American War, and so War of the Spanish Succession is going to be a little tough for me. And then third, the strong resolve to, quote, make war feed war. That's John Lynn's expression again. And what he means by that is to conduct operations that would capture cities and regions that could supply new wealth and new resources, because because fighting this War of the Spanish Succession, like all wars in the age of limited war, were very expensive to prosecute. And then next, you have the power of the influence of attrition. And this repeats a point that I just now made. The long struggle placed tremendous strain upon the state's financial and other resources. And so Louis XIV, year after year, he's continuing this struggle, but he's just spending lots and lots of money, keeping his army in the field, supplying it, and so forth. And the same thing is true for the powers of the Allies. And this created a situation where you've got something you might not expect, which is ongoing diplomatic negotiations that begin early in the war and continue throughout. Because gaining an acceptable settlement to the war involved the interplay of three things. Battlefield success, yes, but then also financial exhaustion and then diplomatic skill. I'm quoting here directly from one of John Lynn's books. So even as a succession of battlefield victories might seem to push in one direction, diplomacy might move in another as the weight of attrition became insupportable. And again, these negotiations began early in the war and continued all the way through. So it's pointless, really, to examine the campaigns of the war, which continued year after year without major results. So it's best just to look at one important siege and one important battle. And in this segment of the lecture, we're going to look at one important siege. That siege is that of Lille in 1708. This is a 1742 painting of the siege. Let's talk about the background to this siege. In the decades before the war, Vauban, the great French military engineer, had convinced Louis XIV, to create what Vauban called pré-carré. And the pré-carré is spelled, and actually you can kind of see it when underneath les fortifications down at the bottom right of the map. It's spelled correctly there, pré-carré, with an accent aigu over the E in pré, another accent aigu over the E in carré. So the term pré-carré had two meanings. The first was kind of a dueling field. And the second implied that the frontier of France needed to be straightened or squared off to make it more defensible. And so part of Louis the 14th's strategy when he made war was to capture certain areas that would rationalize his frontier, so that instead of being like that, running this way, being really really crooked, it's a lot of area to defend because of the twisting and turns of the frontier. The basic thing would be to square off the frontier by eliminating those those squiggles and so forth, by capturing regions that would rationalize the frontier. So, and what he wanted to do was to strongly fortify 25 cities and towns that lay along France's northern frontier, which was the most vulnerable because unlike Eastern France, which had a lot of foothills, steep valleys, few mountains, river barriers, and so forth, that made it sort of complicated for an attacker to advance toward France from that direction. Northern France is characterized by largely flat terrain, which is just ideal for an attacker to come through. So, and the way in which he created this pré-carré was by fortifying these cities in two lines. The first line is along the actual frontier with France, and you can see that it runs from the fortress of Farron up on the English Channel, and then continuing down Ypres, Lille, Tournai, and so forth, going on down from there. Then there's a second line of fortresses behind that one. But the single most important of these fortresses was that of Lille, which was unusually well placed strategically. And the Allies realized that if they could capture the fortress of Lille, that would go a long way toward enabling them to pierce the pré-carré, the fortification lines of France in general. Because once they captured Lille, for example, at a minimum, they could advance almost 30 miles into France before they encountered the fortress of Arras, which was in the second belt of French fortifications. Now, here is the complete network of fortifications built to protect both the Spanish Netherlands and France. And in the early years of the war, the Allies pierced the line of fortresses defending the northern frontier of the Spanish Netherlands. And so that gave the Allies eventually control of a lot of the Spanish Netherlands. And then the next step was to breach the pré-carré. Now, here is what the defenses of Lille looked like. The city itself was surrounded by the walls of an artillery fortress. But just outside of Lille, the southwest side of Lille, just outside, Vauban constructed a citadel composed of a bastion fort that allowed for continued resistance even after the capture of Lille itself. And incidentally, when referring to fortresses, how to best characterize them, in this course, we are going to use the terms artillery fortress or trace italienne to describe the large belt of fortifications that surround an entire city. Okay, bastion fort is the term we will use to describe the kind of fort created as the citadel of Lille. Now, the siege of Lille began on August 12th, 1708. The attackers were led by Prince Eugene, the best of the Habsburg generals, and the English general, John Churchill, Lord Marlborough, considered one of the finest generals, if not the finest general of the age of limited war. And Marlborough's force Prince Eugene's force consisted of 35,000 besiegers, 120 siege cannon, and 80 heavy mortars. And mortars were a special kind of cannon that were aimed. If you look at the barrel was not aimed straight at the target. The barrel was aimed very high up, and the purpose of the mortars was to lob shells over the walls of the fortress and to shells that would explode inside the city. Now Marlborough, for his part, although he's displayed in this painting, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, where you can scarcely fail to notice that the guy on the cool white horse, that's Marlborough. But that's dramatic license. He was really miles away commanding the 75-man force, whose purpose was to keep back any French attempt to send an army in to relieve the garrison at Lille. And indeed, there was such an army, and it consisted of 100,000 troops that were trying to do just that. And Marlborough expected and kind of wanted a big battle with this force. He didn't mind that it had superior numbers. He was a superior general. But this battle never occurred. Now, this detail shows the gradual advance of the Habsburg siege lines. And you can see them, clearly on most of this map. You can see sort of the gray lines represent the trenches, and you can see that some of the trenches run parallel to the fortress, and there are siege cannon arrayed with them. And then you see other trenches that are moving forward toward the fortress, and then what they'll do is they'll get forward to a certain extent, and then they'll dig out, ultimately parallel to the fortification belt, build up, bring up new siege artillery, and then besiege the city from a closer range. And note the similarity here to the techniques of Vauban, which by this time everybody had begun to recognize. This guy knows what he's doing. But what you can also see is that they lacked the sophistication of Vauban, his sort of mathematical precision. Now, in charge of defending the city was Marshal Boufflers, and he had a garrison of 16,000 troops and 159 heavy cannon defending the ramparts of the city and then also of the citadel. And Boufflers didn't just stay within the walls of the artillery fortress. He conducted an active defense. For instance, he would dispatch raiding parties to go after the Habsburg engineers who were digging, these approach trenches and digging parallels and so forth. And when these raiding parties got to those engineers, they killed them killed or wounded them by the dozen, which was not just bad in itself, but also delayed the progress of the siege significantly. And by the time that Boufflers offered to surrender the city, but not the citadel, that was on October 22nd when he made this offer. The siege had already gone on for 2.5 months, so he'd managed to hold off the Habsburgs and indirectly the English for 2 months already, 2.5 months already. And at this point, he had inflicted a staggering total of 12,000 casualties on Prince Eugene's besieging force. And so the negotiated arrangement he secured with Prince Eugene was really on fairly generous terms, because Eugene was, taking a lot of casualties in the course of capturing Lille. And so the deal that he struck with Prince Eugene was that, okay, I'm going to surrender the city of Lille to you on the condition that I can take my troops to the citadel. Prince Eugene agreed to this arrangement. That is what was done. And from the citadel, Boufflers was able to continue resistance for another 6 weeks, inflicting, we think, about an additional 2,000 casualties on Prince Eugene's forces. And so when he finally formally surrendered the citadel on December 10th, 1708, Prince Eugene allowed the forces of Marshal Boufflers to march out with the full honors of war. Now, this December date is significant because until the 20th century, wars, campaigns were limited by the seasons. They typically started in the spring, they continued through the summer and early November. But once the weather started turning cold, military operations became increasingly less possible. The cold made things, dangerous for the troops. The rain and the snow, turned the roads into muddy soup, and so armies in the 18th century and most of the 19th century went into winter quarters during the winter and did not resume active operations until the spring of the next year, in this case 1709. And so essentially, Marshal Boufflers had ended the Allied advance for the year of 1708. They would not be able to resume active operations until some months later, to the beginning of spring, thereby granting France a much needed respite from the war. And so when Marshal Boufflers returned to Paris, it was not as a defeated commander who had to give up an important fortress city, but as a great hero. And his brilliant 5-month defense of Lille was regarded as a brilliant achievement. And when he returned to Paris, he was lavishly awarded by King Louis XIV, who even gave him a peerage called Peerage, an honor bestowed on only the highest ranking members of the French nobility. Not bad. I'm going to stop recording at this point. Another awkward point in this thing, and then we'll wait for the next section.